And this is KAOS 89.3 FM, Olympia Community Radio. The following commentary is not necessarily the opinions of the staff, management, or underwriters of KAOS or the Evergreen State College. It is the opinions of the guest and the host. That being said, it's time to talk a little bit about some of the things coming up in the community. Olympia Community Radio, and this is also Parallel University, here every week. This is my 16th year on the air, and my name is Kim Dobson. And up this week, we have Darcy Richardson. And Darcy is an author, and he has several books out there. His most recent is Others, Third Parties During the Populist Period of America's Political Season. So, yes, it's fourth in the volume of a series on U.S. third parties. His most recent book is Bernie, a Lifelong Crusade Against Wall Street and Wealth. His previous books included A Nation Divided and this other book I just mentioned, Other. So we're going to be talking about the fact that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump continue to register with unusually high negatives in what is clearly shaping up as a classic duopoly battle between the despised, the country's nationally organized third parties have a genuine opportunity to be more than a minor footnote in the 2016 election. So, coming right up after a couple of messages, we're going to have Darcy Richardson on to talk about populism. The following comments are not necessarily the opinions of the staff, management, or underwriters of KAOS or the Evergreen State College. They are the opinions of the guests and the host. And that being said, well, we are going to hear from Hospice Without Borders here.
Hospice Without Borders invites you to join them in an opportunity to shine at the Auctioning Gala June 25th at 5 p.m. Hospice Without Borders is celebrating 5 years of service, bringing hospice and palliative care to the most vulnerable locally and abroad. The event is located at Annie Wright School, 827 North Tacoma Avenue, Tacoma, Washington. Tickets are available at hwb.eventb.com. More information at hospicewithoutborders.com.
All right, and in the second half of the program, we are going to be hearing from Hospice Without Borders, 15-minute piece produced by Anch Bergerson, one of our world music hosts here, and the recording staff and engineers of KAOS. So that will be in the second half hour. And also, in the last part of the program, we're going to be hearing from Paul Cienfuegos about his Community Rights Ordinances podcasts that he produces down in Portland, Oregon. And we're going to hear a little bit more about how communities are protecting themselves from corporate power and overreach, and how it's done. What are the most effective methods, and parties on the air with us now. Everything about the program, Darcy, Community Rights Ordinance.
Well, thank you, Kim. Thank you for the invitation. Great to be here.
Yes, we had a short conversation yesterday on third parties, and the seeming the tight spot that independents are at, where in this election, many of the voters that following the Bernie Sanders campaign pretty closely, as I was a delegate to the state convention this last Saturday, we are 75% of the electorate here in the state, and our superdelegates refused to come along with this, so there was a lot of contention at the convention, and we endorsed Bernie Sanders for president on the state level, but our elected superdelegates refused to go along with this, and we refused to also endorse Hillary. So,
Good for you.
yep, and we're reflecting the will of the people as far as we can see at 75%.
Right.
So,
Yeah, Washington, of course, is one of Bernie's best states with primaries and caucuses. You got about 72 point something percent there.
yeah, it varies in the precinct to precinct, but in the caucuses at the state, there was sadly there was over 400 delegates missing, so the alternates had to be drafted, and the credentials committee was busy, and they were I'm glad they were there, but wasted a lot of time, and we couldn't talk about the platform, so it was just passed at the very end, and they shut us down at 7. Could have gone on for a couple hours more. So anyway, Darcy, that's not what we're going to be talking about. I just wanted to put my 2 cents in that there's a lot of independents that came into this election that were not Democrats. They were independents, Greens, and socialists, and so they all got behind the flag of Bernie Sanders, much to the chagrin of the establishment. So what is it in history? How the third parties that have always kind of been pushed to the sideline because of the duopoly of the Republican and Democratic parties. Can you start off and give us a little bit of history on what happened in Texas with the farmers and the new movement back in the mid 1880s and 90s, where populism started and why it started?
Yes, great question. The populist movement really wasn't an agrarian movement, as you mentioned, and really had its roots in places like Texas and on the East Coast, North Carolina. And the populist movement was, in a way, almost a continuation of the old Greenback Labor Party, which was also a farmer-oriented movement in the mid-1870s. The Greenback Labor Party had actually elected 14 members of Congress at one point, and ran presidential candidates in 1876, 1880 when they ran General James B. Weaver, who pulled over 1 million votes, and in 1884 they had a very colorful candidate in General Benjamin Butler. But the party died out after the 84, 85 period. They continued to run candidates sporadically in Pennsylvania and some other places. So going into the 1888 election, the farmers, or many of the farmers who were active in the Greenback Labor Party, moved over to a very short-lived party, which was the Union Labor Party. And the Union Labor Party fielded a presidential ticket in 1888. And shortly after that election was really the founding of the Populist Party. And the Populist Party was very significant, won a number of Senate seats. Of course, senators were elected by the state legislature in those days. Won numerous state legislative contests around the country, elected congressmen, elected governors in 4 or 5 states. And but it too eventually petered out. Its high watermark was probably 1896, when the Populist Party fused with the Democratic Party in supporting William Jennings Bryan for president. And the Populist Party, the radicals within the Populist Party, they insisted on their own vice presidential candidate, writer Tom Watson, novelist Tom Watson from Georgia. And so it was kind of odd. There were the Democratic and Populist fusion ticket with 2 separate vice presidential candidates. out. It continued to run candidates in 1904, 1908. In fact, they were token candidacies led by Watson. So that's kind of a brief thumbnail of some of the agrarian parties, at the presidential level in American history. There is a party I would like to mention, since this is being broadcast in Washington. This is a very interesting National Farmer Labor Party was founded in 1919, and in 1920, and of course 1919 was the year of the famous Seattle General Strike, 5-day strike statewide, involving about 65,000 workers in Seattle. Really shut the city down. It's a nonviolent work stoppage. But there was a lot of the IWW, the Wofleys, were really active in that period, and they had aligned with the AFL and to hold the general strike. And during that period, nationally, there was a Farmer Labor Party founded, basically based in Chicago, but it spread to many western states, including the state of Washington, which ended up being the party's stronghold. This is unbelievable, but in the 1920 presidential election, the Farmer Labor Party nominated a little-known candidate. He was an attorney for the Wofleys. His name was Parley Christensen. And Parley Christensen conducted a nationwide campaign, but he only appeared on the ballot in about 18 or 19 states that year. But Washington was one of them. And in the general election that year, the Farmer Labor Party nearly finished second in the presidential race. Harding, of course, carried Washington, which was a solidly Republican state in those days. And the Democratic candidate only finished 7,000 votes ahead of Farmer Labor ticket. So there's a really rich history in Washington involving, third parties on the left of the political spectrum. But what was so amazing about that race is that the much better known Eugene Debs, the socialist who was campaigning for president from the prison cell in the Atlanta penitentiary, he received 9,000 votes in Washington, where Christensen, little known nationally, he was actually from Utah. He was a former Utah legislator who later served on the Los Angeles City Council. But little known Christensen pulled 77,000 votes in Washington and pulled over a third of the vote in the 19 counties in the western part of the state, I think including Thurston County. And it's just amazing that it's like a footnote in history that most people are not aware of. But the Farmer Labor Party actually had a stronghold, one stronghold in the entire country, and it was the state of Washington. They nearly elected the governor that year. This was 1920. The Farmer Labor Party nominated Robert Bridges, who was a former land commissioner for the state of Washington, and he ended up polling 121,000 votes, finishing second or first in quite a few counties. And they thought he was going to win, except that his Democratic opponent, who ended up finishing third in that race, leaked. It was kind of not really a dirty trick, but he leaked information that Bridges had leased land to 2 Japanese tenants. And of course, anti-Japanese sentiment was really strong in the West in those days, and including Washington. And so, had it not been for that, at the very end of the campaign, Bridges would have been elected as Farmer Labor governor of the state of Washington. So I said a little thumbnail about history there that I thought I'd throw in. But Washington has a rich history with independent and third-party candidates.
There's also another sidebar there, Darcy. We're speaking with Darcy Richardson, the author of a 4-part volume on U.S. third parties. There was also, during that time, on the lead up to the 1920 election, there was a happening called the Centralia Massacre, known as the Armistice Day Riot. And it was they say here on Wikipedia it was a violent and bloody incident that occurred in Centralia, Washington, November 11th, 1919, and during a parade celebrating the first anniversary of the Armistice Day. It was a conflict between the American Legion workers and who were members of the Industrial Workers of the World. It resulted in 6 deaths, additional wounded, and multiple prison terms, and ongoing, especially bitter dispute over the motivations and events that precipitated the massacre. So it was years of bad blood between the members of the local Legion and members of the IWW. So
yeah, exactly. And the American Legion had taken a strong stand against the general strike as well in Seattle, which was earlier in the year, February, I believe. And the American Legion were dubbing almost anyone in the AFL and the IWW at that point as being influenced by the Bolsheviks. So yeah, there was a lot of tension there between the American Legion and other patriotic groups. I put that in quotes, and organized labor.
yeah, there's apparently there was this event attracted national media attention, and that notoriety had contributed to the Red Scare of 1920, creation of a powerful martyr for the IWW, in addition to Joe Hill. So, yeah. Anyway, just a little bit of local history for our listeners that might be interested in what's gone down here in the way of labor struggles. So I know that you've written a 4-volume set on populism here, and I know nothing compared to what you know. So where would you like to go in history from this? Because we may not have enough time to cover 4-volume set. So
Right.
I guess we need a synopsis and then some kind of a segue into current times and what voters are up against now.
Sure. I've written so far 4 volumes in a planned 7-volume set, but it's covering independent and third-party politics, essentially from the nation's founding up to the present day. So my 5th volume is scheduled to come out in December, and that's third parties during the Great Depression. So that's where I'm at with the writing, and the 6th and 7th volumes will come out probably in 18. I definitely want to get those published before the 2020 presidential election. So what happens this year will be covered in my 7th final volume. And there's a lot happening this year let me put it this way, there's a great opportunity for the country's nationally organized third parties in this presidential election cycle, given the really high unfavorability ratings of both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, what's a person to do? Well, there's always been suggestion of going to ranked voting and top 2 where and also how about letting third-party candidates into the presidential debates? I mean this.
Right. Exactly.
I liked it better when the League of Women Voters was in charge instead of the parties.
I think I did too. I've run for statewide office on third-party tickets in the past, the Consumer Party in Pennsylvania. And when I was 24, I ran for state auditor general. And, I pulled maybe about 1.1% of the vote. But the League of Women Voters invited me to the statewide televised debate. I mean, they didn't have this criteria like the Commission on Presidential Debates does today, that a candidate has to be at, say, 15% in at least 5 national polls to be included. So it's a pretty high barrier, and or pretty high bar, I should say. And but that's what Gary Johnson, the Libertarian Party nominee, and the Green Party's Jill Stein both face. And there have been some encouraging signs Jill's case, she hasn't been included, and her name hasn't been mentioned in as many polls as Johnson has. So a lot of the polls, when they'll call individuals and list candidates, they usually exclude Jill Stein's name. But there have been 3 or 4 recently where they've included her name, and she's consistently polled 4 to 5%. And then on Monday, in the poll released by CNN, they have her at 7%. So there's a chance that one of them or both of them, Johnson and Stein, could get close to the 15% mark if they, continue to get some, mainstream media coverage, which Johnson is starting to get a lot. But Jill Stein really hasn't been afforded that opportunity yet. Yeah, she's still at 7%, which is pretty amazing.
Just as a sidebar, Jill Stein was in Tacoma in a park across the street from the Tacoma Convention Center where the state Democratic convention was being held. And she was collecting signatures for her inclusion onto the ballot this fall.
Right.
She's running a pretty strong campaign to grassroots initiative to gather signatures for that to happen in 48 states. I'm not sure about, there's 2 states where she's having a hard time getting on the ticket because they've placed so many barriers in the way of third-party candidates. I'm not sure what those 2 states are, but
yeah, there's actually 3 that the Greens are struggling with. One is Indiana, and their deadline, a candidate petition needs a minimum of 26,700 ballot signatures, and Jill Stein really is struggling. So Indiana's pretty much a lost cause, barring some sort of a legal action. There's little chance she'll make it there. The other 2 tough ones are Oklahoma, where they really haven't even started, and their deadline is also approaching. It's July 15th, but it's very difficult. Get a full party on the ballot in Oklahoma. You need 24,745 signatures and over 40,000 if you just try to file as an independent. And the other one that looks like it's out of their grasp would be North Carolina, which has a ridiculous, it's so discriminatory and burdensome, a requirement of 89,000 signatures. And, the Greens have just kind of thrown their hands up. And but Rick Last, their ballot access coordinator, hasn't rolled out legal action in all 3 states. And beyond that, we have a very plausible chance to get on the ballot in the other 47 states around the country. You always have to worry about some sort of minor technicality keeping the party off, but they're pretty optimistic. I'm predicting that we'll get on the ballot in at least 45 states. 47 would be great, and then depending whether or not they try to litigate Indiana, Oklahoma, North Carolina. I'm thinking 45 is probably a realistic number. 47 would be great.
yeah, that would be great if they could make it on. Getting the third parties on the ballot. Obviously, what Ralph Nader said about there being a duopoly is absolutely true in this country, and the 2 parties have locked us in here to the lesser of evils sort of choices. When in fact, when you look at swing states and you don't want to see Donald Trump on the ballot, you don't want to see him be elected, you're probably going to want to vote Hillary, in fact, to keep Trump out of the presidency. I'm not sure if Hillary's any better, but a blue state like Washington State, you're probably pretty safe voting a third-party ticket, and it probably will not affect the outcome of the election here because we usually elect Democratic presidents.
Mm-hmm.
So that being said, history bears that out, but of course I'm not going to tell anybody what to do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just suggesting that is a possibility. people want to vote their conscience, and I think that's the right here in this country, and I don't think anybody should be forced to vote what they don't want to vote in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm personally, of course, I'm a third-party guy, but I'm in a swing state, a heavily, highly competitive state, Florida, in the presidential election. But as I have always done, I will vote for the third-party candidate, of my choosing. You know what I mean? So, I think Jill has the potential to do very well. Probably better, like you said, in some of the safer states where one party is almost certain to win. But I think with her message, she is going to pull votes even in the highly competitive states this time. A lot of people just cannot. I think it's according to an April poll by McClatchy Maris, as many as a quarter of Bernie's supporters can't bring themselves to support Hillary. So, whether that'll change as we get closer to November, and the numbers start peeling off, or whether they're firmly, determined, or they just cannot bring themselves to do that. That could bode very well for Jill.
Indeed. Hey, Darcy, we've got to wrap this up, and we've been speaking with Darcy Richardson, and Darcy is the author of Others, a 4-volume series of U.S. third parties. Your most recent book is Bernie, a lifelong crusade against Wall Street and wealth. And your previous books include A Nation Divided, the 1968 presidential campaign, which might be very interesting coming on the air with us. Looking forward to speaking with you again as this election progresses, if you're open to the idea. And
absolutely.
We do a little bit of an analysis of all of this and how it looks. Definitely. Thank you so much for coming on the air with us today.
Thank you, Kim.
Yeah, right.
Take care.
This is KAOS 89.3 FM, Olympia Community Radio. Following commentary is not necessarily the opinions of the staff, management, or underwriters of KAOS or the Evergreen State College. It is the opinions of the guest and the host.
In Kigali, which is the capital city, there's a lot of survivors from the genocide back in the 90s who are reaching that stage of transition in their life. And so there's a lot of work done with those people who are in the hospice stage. Also, bereavement care for the families.
I recently came to know what hospice care does in general here in the South Sound area. I know there's 2 general hospice organizations, and the one that supported my family and my loved one who passed away. Their work is really remarkable. They not only eased and comforted our loved one who was in her last days and weeks of life, but they supported our family as well. And I don't know how we could have gotten through without it. And they're just a band of angels. And now I completely respect and appreciate this critical work. But overseas, in the country of Rwanda, hospice need is no less so. Are the needs there generally being met? Is there a whole network of hospice caregivers over there generally?
That's a good question. Hospice Without Borders, they partner with the national government of Rwanda, and there are other organizations that they work with, specifically for bereavement care, working with people, for example, Life After Loss Rwanda, which is LALR, which is a component that helps teach people sewing so that they can sew and create an income for themselves while learning bereavement.
So those who are the survivors have issues and grieving, but also particularly if you've lost a major breadwinner. Mm-hmm. So you actually help them in an economic way by getting back on their feet and finding a livelihood. That's amazing and so critically needed. What else do you do over in Rwanda as an organization?
Inside of Rwanda, I think it's the main thing that Hospice Without Borders has done is get oral solution of morphine into the country in partnering with the national government, which has been instrumental in pain management, which is, according to the organization's mission statement, it's a human right to be able to manage physical pain, and it's part of a social and peace-building effort. If people are able to essentially die peacefully and know that they have a community of support and their pain is managed, it actually strengthens community.
It's a compassionate way for us to care in as much as we can for those in the end stage of life. It's a serious drug, and it's not one that we trivially handle and access. It's gratifying to know that Hospice Without Borders makes this available to citizens in need in Rwanda. What do you folks do over here locally? You mentioned something called
Amahoro House.
Amahoro House. What is Amahoro House for?
Well, Amahoro House, it's located here in Olympia. It's the Hospice Respite Care Center locally here inside of Olympia in the Ralph's Thriftway neighborhood off of 4th Avenue. Amahoro means peace, and the service of Amahoro reaches specifically the homeless population here around Thurston County. Within the past year, the mission and focus of Amahoro House has been working with the Interfaith Works overnight emergency shelter, doing respite care, and when we're able to do so, host a guest at the house who's on hospice.
So let's take that to a more personal level. You have an individual who's homeless. If that individual is sick, meets a certain threshold of critical sickness, they could be admitted to hospital. But if they're sick, but not hospital qualified, but they don't have a place to be, to call their own, a place to feel safe and rest and be cared for and be left in peace, that's a really hard way to get through a day. So Amahoro House, what does it do? What kind of relief does it provide for such an individual?
Those individuals are referred to by the shelter.
That's managed by Interfaith Works.
That's exact. Amahoro House tries not to be a directive, a supportive element in that. And so if there's someone who is needing respite care, oftentimes it could be anywhere from just a half a day to a week or more. Volunteers get together along with the staff of Amahoro and basically create cooking meals, providing any kind of medical respite, whether it's changing bandages or assisting with showers, any type of caregiving skills, to give that person a sense of humanity, community, that you deserve to be taken care of, not just your medical needs, but you deserve to be heard.
More often than not, with this kind of work, there's far more need than there are beds and dollars. Talk about the challenge that you have. Do you have enough hands, volunteers, and resources to do the work you need to do here in Africa?
Well, I definitely think there's always room for more volunteers. And the founders, Dr. David Slack and co-founder, registered nurse Angela Lee, are both very inspirational in reminding and setting the example that it's about building community, that there's a oneness around the volunteer and the person who's being served. It's a give and take. To answer your question, yes, there's always room for more volunteers, and there's always the challenges of meeting those needs of, quite frankly, there's a high homeless population, not just in Olympia, but throughout the country.
You know, there's an opportunity coming up for people to get to know Hospice Without Borders. There's a gala and an auction at the end of this month. It's a great opportunity for any of us to attend so you could hear more, learn more about what this great organization does here and in Rwanda and what their needs are and how a person can get involved. I imagine there's so many ways. I want to talk a little more about this event coming up at the end of June. But first, do you know how they got started? How did Dr. David Slack and Nurse Angela Lee think to do this kind of work and in such a far-flung place?
They were both working in hospice, palliative care, and seeing the need for basically a compassionate care. Well, let me take a step back. For a lot of people, hospice caregiving specifically is very intimidating. Oftentimes family finds it difficult to approach someone who's suffering or at the end of their life.
If we may, I know a lot of people know what hospice and palliative care are, but there are, I imagine, some of our listeners who don't. And I did not know it until my family arrived into this state. So I understand hospice care is something that a patient enters into when they are identified, usually by a medical professional, as really approaching the end of life. And there's nothing more medically that could be done to cure the illness. And so all that can be done for them medically is to provide comfort. comfort care, love. And palliative care is similar, however, there's potential for cure or not, but it's a likelihood of enduring even longer.
Yeah, that's correct. The technical answer for like hospice care usually is the six-month one, and if a client or patient falls into that, that's basically when family and the individual is really starting to get things together and prepared for the transition. And both Dr. Slack and Angela, we came to the realization that there's a real need for, especially people who are on hospice, to feel that compassion, to feel like they're being heard and there's a bearing witness to what it is they're going through. Because oftentimes a lot of people will get that diagnosis or that being told that they're on hospice, and they maybe only had a year or 8 months before they knew they had this illness.
Yes.
So that's not a lot of time to prepare.
Adjust, emotionally, to accept
Yeah.
the new realities.
Exactly.
It's a really sensitive time, and as we mentioned earlier, hospice care isn't just for the patient, but their family. Of course, here in Olympia at Amahora House, I imagine a lot of your patients have no family around, so the volunteer caregivers end up being kind of surrogate family for the duration of a patient's remaining days.
Absolutely. I would say that's very accurate, and it happens automatically. It's kind of this sense of you see yourself in the other person, and there's this mirroring effect that happens. And there's neuroscience out there that says compassion changes the brain. There's something that happens when people come together, whether you're giving compassion or someone's receiving it. There's a neurochemistry change in the brain, and it's healthy. So it's a give and take. It's not one-sided. So that's why there's a sense of, yes, community, and like you said, there's a sense of family around it.
Tell me, this event coming up, it's a gala, last Saturday of June.
That's great. It's June 25th, and it starts at 5 p.m.
And it's an auction and gala, and it takes place at the Annie Wright School in Tacoma. A summer celebration of 5 years of service bringing hospice and palliative care to the most vulnerable locally and abroad, nurturing the living, journeying alongside the dying. Well, it's some of the most important work we could do as a society, really, to support those who are in the last part of their life's journey. So this event is June 25th. It's a Saturday, the last Saturday of the month. It starts at 5 p.m. and it's up in Tacoma at the Annie Wright School. That's 827 North Tacoma Avenue.
Well, you can expect to have fun, meet a lot of interesting and very positive people. Inspiring people, exactly. And
you'll learn about what the organization does.
Learn about what the organization does.
In great depth, yeah.
A lot of the members of the organizations and people who live in Tacoma and Olympia will be there to answer any questions, or if there's any interest in the organization or getting involved.
And there's training, by the way, if a person wanted to volunteer at Amahora House. You just don't get tossed into the pool.
That's correct.
You get trained to do the job right.
The training is amazing. It's very good training.
In a moment, I want to let our listeners know how they can find out more information. But before we let you go, Andrew, I want to ask you, how did you get involved? What drew you to Hospice Without Borders, and what keeps you as involved as you are?
Well, I met David and Angela about 2 years ago, and I had heard and read about hospice before, and actually I had done a little bit of kind of accompaniment with people in nursing homes. We'd sit together and read, and it got me thinking about, I really enjoy listening to people tell their stories.
Yeah.
And I remember a man who was 90 years old, and he was telling me about all his favorite presidents. And so that kind of just got me interested in hospice.
And they really enjoy telling the stories and being heard.
And being heard.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that really hooked me into volunteering and training with Amahora House is I heard once, and I'll never forget this, that the greatest gift you can give somebody is your presence.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that's constantly, the example is set, constantly volunteering with Hospice Without Borders. You're constantly in that because the other volunteers, the staff, are constantly doing that.
They share the same spirit.
They share the same spirit, and you kind of automatically get into that state of just being with whatever is happening,
Yeah.
whoever's there, and it's kind of a spontaneous.
It's a good crowd to run with, isn't it?
It is a very good crowd to run with.
Yeah.
It's always a good time. You're always laughing, joking, sometimes crying.
I mean, it's not easy work. It's really hard work. It's not jolly work, and yet there's something tremendously positive and uplifting in doing this kind of difficult work. It renews our humanity all the time, doesn't it? And reminds us that we are compassionate beings. And like we said earlier, it counteracts the harshness and the negative that exists in life. And that's a good thing. Thank you for being here with us, Andrew. And it's an honor to know that your organization exists in doing this work here in Olympia and in Rwanda.
And that was our Community Connections report on Hospice Without Border. And thanks to Anch and all of the production staff here at KAOS. So coming up next is another old friend of ours here at KAOS and in Olympia, Paul Fuegos, who a little history, started the Community Skills Exchange and community alternative currencies, where you could exchange your hours for credits, or you could exchange money for community script, such as Ithaca's Ithaca dollar. So anyway, Paul's off doing other things. Community rights ordinances is now his big thing, and he produces a weekly program down in Portland, Oregon, and we're going to play a couple of them. So here goes. We're going to start with one that is from the last week of May, and here goes. Thanks for listening to KAOS.
Listening to the weekly commentary by yours truly, Paul Fuegos. Today I'm going to share some very exciting news with you about a small township in Pennsylvania that made history earlier this month. Here's an excerpt from a news article about it in a wonderful online journal of investigative reporting called Public Herald. On May 3rd, Grant Township in Indiana County, Pennsylvania made a bit of history. The municipality passed a local law legalizing civil disobedience. According to the new law, anyone who commits a nonviolent act of civil disobedience in order to protect the community's rights under its home rule charter has the legal right to do so, but not only that, the law also prohibits, quote, any private or public actor from bringing criminal charges or filing any civil or other criminal action against those participating in nonviolent direct action, unquote. In November 2015, Grant became the first municipal community to establish a local Bill of Rights, which also happened to ban fracking wastewater injection. Before that, Grant Township made history in 2014 when it became the first place where an ecosystem filed to defend itself in a lawsuit. Grant Township's story is a rebellious one and plays a feature part in Public Herald's upcoming documentary Invisible Hand, which will be released in October. Grant's local lawmaking strategy challenges the corporate status quo head-on, attempting to rewrite state and national law in order to let communities have first and final say in what goes down there. As it stands, communities across the globe are grappling with how to protect themselves against industrial corporate harm that is permitted by state and federal agencies, which essentially forces a certain amount of risk onto citizens of the community without its consent. In the United States, we have freedom of speech and assembly, but anyone who civilly disobeys the government is subject to criminal and civil charges, like disorderly conduct or rioting that can include fines and jail time. Civil disobedience is a common tactic used throughout history when people decide that enough is enough. As Grant Township Supervisor Stacy Long explained, quote, "We are tired of being told by corporations and our so-called environmental regulatory agencies that we can't stop this injection well. This isn't a game. We're being threatened by a corporation with a history of permit violations, and that corporation wants to dump toxic frack wastewater into our township."
KAOS 89.3 FM, Olympia Community Radio. Following commentary is not necessarily the opinions of the staff, management, or underwriters of KAOS or the Evergreen State College. It is the opinions of the guest and the host.
A press release about Grant's new law reveals backing from Tim DeChristopher, who spent nearly 2 years in prison for civil disobedience he carried out to block the auction of public lands in the Red Rock country of southern Utah to oil and gas companies for drilling, fracking, mining. DeChristopher posed as a bidder in the auction and won bids for 22,000 acres of public land that were later determined were never supposed to be auctioned in the first place. DeChristopher is co-founder of the Climate Disobedience Center. Regarding Grant Township, he stated, quote, "I'm encouraged to see an entire community and its elected officials asserting their rights to defend their community from the assaults of the fossil fuel industry, and I know there are plenty of folks in the climate movement ready to stand with Grant Township," unquote. Grant Township Supervisor and Chairman John Perry summed up the township's ongoing several-year battle by saying, quote, "Sides need to be picked. Should a polluting corporation have the right to inject toxic waste, or should a community have the right to protect itself? I was elected to serve this community and to protect the rights in our charter voted in by the people I represented. If we have to physically and nonviolently stop the trucks from coming in because the courts fail us, we will do so, and we invite others to stand with us," unquote. I've been reading excerpts from an online article on May 4th at publicherald.org, an amazing online investigative journal. Their new documentary titled Invisible Hand about communities exercising their constitutional rights against harmful corporations will be released in October. If you're interested in supporting the brave people of Grant Township, Pennsylvania, who just weeks ago legalized nonviolent civil disobedience to defend their community from harmful corporate activities, please contact Stacy Long at lemonphone28@gmail.com. That's lemonphone28@gmail.com or 724-840-7214. You've been listening to the weekly commentary by yours truly, Paul Cienfuegos. You can hear future commentaries every Tuesday on the Cable Evening News in Portland, Oregon, and on a growing number of other radio stations. I welcome your feedback. You can subscribe to my weekly podcast via iTunes or at communityrightspdx.org. You can sign up for my community rights updates at paulcienfuegos.com. You can follow me on Twitter at cienfuegospaul. Thanks for listening, and remember, we are the people we've been waiting for. Greetings, you're listening to the weekly commentary by yours truly, Paul Cienfuegos. Last Friday, the Columbia River dodged a bullet that may very well forever alter the ecological risk-taking that our state and federal agencies have allowed for decades. A 96-car oil train partially derailed while passing through Mosier, a small town of 440 residents. Owned by Union Pacific Corporation and originating in the Bakken crude oil fields of North Dakota, the train was traveling slowly on a section of straight track when it derailed. 16 of its 96 cars left the track, 4 caught on fire, 3 of them ruptured and released at least 10,000 gallons of crude oil into the sewage treatment plant, which had to be immediately shut down. And now the town has no safe source of water because the firefighters drained the entire aquifer fighting this enormous blaze. Imagine, because an oil train derailed next to a small town, its residents can no longer safely flush their toilets, and they're going to have to strictly ration their water use until the rains return at the end of the year. But it could have been much, much worse. Here's how the Oregonian's reporter Rob Davis opened his lead story on page 1 a few days ago. 800 feet in either direction and Friday's oil train derailment outside the small Columbia River Gorge city of Mosier might have sent flaming tank cars into a lake in a national scenic area. A half-mile east and the inferno would have burned a few feet beneath a block of modular homes. Another mile and a half and leaking tank cars would have landed on the bank of the Columbia River during peak spring Chinook salmon migration. 7 miles west and flames would have licked the back of the Full Sail Brewing Company in Hood River. Further yet, and Multnomah Falls tourists could have watched the smoke plume from atop the Benson footbridge. With the fire out and the recovery and damage assessment beginning Saturday, one thing was obvious: the Pacific Northwest got lucky. The region's first fiery wreck since oil traffic skyrocketed in 2012 didn't kill anyone. Only a small amount of oil was spotted in the river. No homes or businesses burned down. All of the things that could have happened didn't happen, said Michael Ayer, a retired state rail safety inspector. Move this incident 60 miles west into Portland, same railroad, same product, same rail car, and you have a whole different situation. One of the most important messages that I've consistently tried to make in this weekly commentary is that we the people have been hoodwinked if we think the regulatory system of law is here to keep us safe. In fact, it was designed way back in the 1880s to funnel citizen activism into dead-end political processes run by political appointees who were entirely unaccountable to we the people. So it's no surprise that our politicians are already putting out statements that fit neatly within this framework, demanding tougher rail safety regulations rather than saying what we all know to be true, that oil and coal trains passing through our gorge is unacceptable, the risk is simply too great, and we must ban them now. For example, Governor Kate Brown has already told us she's limited in what she can do, that she doesn't have the legal authority to ban these trains. And she's right, which is exactly the point I'm trying to make here. It's currently illegal to ban oil and coal trains from passing through the gorge. Why? Because such a ban would violate the Union Pacific Corporation's so-called rights under the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And because rail traffic is regulated by the feds, our state government is preempted from having any meaningful say in what happens next. Here's what the governor's spokesperson, Kristen Granger, said a few days ago. The governor, quote, will continue fighting for the strongest possible safety measures from federal policymakers and regulators to bolster rail safety here in Oregon and across the country, unquote. In other words, another oil train derailment is inevitable. I wish there was something more we could do. Sorry about that. On the other hand, Mosier's fire chief, Jim Appleton, is beginning to see the light. He told Oregon Public Broadcasting that while he previously defended the safety of shipping oil by rail, he now thinks the shipments are insane, and he hopes that this becomes the death knell for this mode of shipping of oil. Now just imagine if Mosier's fire chief went from merely hoping to actually initiating a long overdue dialogue of local residents and their city council members that focuses on one central question. Has the time arrived for Mosier to take back its authority to govern itself and to pass a local law that bans oil and coal trains from passing through Mosier? If they took that brave step, they would be joining 200 other communities in 9 states that have already stepped outside of these ridiculous structures of law, such as corporate constitutional rights and federal and state preemption, and passed groundbreaking, locally enforceable community rights ordinances. When a community finally gets it, that our government is not protecting its citizens, and that it's not just a few bad apples that are the problem, that in fact the existing system of law itself is the problem. The sky is the limit to what a community could accomplish in its local lawmaking. Just take Columbia County, for example, 100 miles downstream from Mosier, where signatures are already being gathered to put on the ballot a community rights ordinance to ban oil and coal trains and fossil fuel export terminals anywhere in Columbia County. Imagine what could happen if the people of these two counties got acquainted and mobilized together to stop this insanity. And what can you do to contribute to this conversation? Start telling anyone who will listen that it's time for Mosier and other communities along the tracks to stand up and say, enough is enough. We don't want stronger regulations, we want a total ban, and we want it now. You've been listening to the weekly commentary by yours truly, Paul Cienfuegos. You can hear future commentaries every Tuesday on the Cable Evening News in Portland, Oregon, and on a growing number of other radio stations. I welcome your feedback. You can subscribe to my weekly podcast via iTunes or at communityrightspdx.org. You can sign up for my community rights updates at paulcienfuegos.com. You can follow me on Twitter at cienfuegospaul. Thanks for listening, and remember, we are the people we've been waiting for.
All right, ran a little bit over the top of the hour. This is KAOS 89.3 FM, Olympia Community Radio, and broadcasting from the Evergreen State College in the public service of. This has been Parallel University. I'm your host, Kim Dobson. And up next is Neural Loop.